Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Dan Lanning, the Oregon Ducks, heading into fall camp about 7 days from now. I want to look at kind of some of our bigger storylines for this Oregon Ducks program heading into fall camp. The three things I think we want to touch on: one, the position battles. And it's not necessarily who's going to be starting for this Oregon team, but kind of figuring out what the pecking order is for a couple of these different position groups where, till you look at the depth of this program, you have guys in the 2 and 3 deep that would be clear starters on a lot of other Power 4 programs across the country, going to predict some breakout performers. I think that's my favorite segment, where you kind of look at the young talent on this Oregon team, and it seems like every single year you kind of hear some whispers about some young cats that are going to make that stride. We're going to predict some of those guys and then talk about some depth question marks we have. Fired up to get into it. Before we do, and as always, just want to say thank you to you guys and to the Oregon fans. It's no secret we love talking this program, whether it's on the recruiting trail, whether it's the upcoming 2024 season. The amount of support y'all continue to show to the fellas, it truly does mean a lot. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Much more importantly, would love to hear some of your fall camp storylines as well, because that's probably the stuff that we're going to be talking about as Oregon goes through fall camp. So let us know what you guys are kind of thinking or curious about for this Oregon program. And Dill, without further ado, let's jump into the position battles. And I want to start with this wide receiver room. I am fascinated in terms of how this wide receiver room shakes out. And at least for me, you have your two wide receiver ones in Tez Johnson and Evan Stewart. I think that is, most Oregon fans are very comfortable making that assumption. I think the question mark is, who's going to be 3, 4, 5? Because you go back to Oregon in 2023. I mean, they kind of primarily use 4 wide receivers a lot, being Troy Franklin, Tez Johnson, Trayshawn Holden, Gary Bryan, then Terrence Ferguson. So you kind of assume that Oregon is going to use maybe 4 to 5 wide receivers quite a bit. If you were kind of predicting what wide receivers kind of grab hold of that rotation, who are you looking at?
Well, that's where it gets interesting, because I know Gary Bryan, Trayshawn Holden played a fair amount last year, but when you kind of look at what they have coming up, it's a different level of talent. You have guys like Jurion Dickey sitting there. You have guys like Kyle Casper who can add something a little bit unique in terms of his size and speed sort of profile. So again, I mean, guys like Evan Stewart and Tez Johnson, their spot, that you can't take them off the field.
Yeah.
I don't think they'd come off the field for any program in the country, but it will be kind of interesting to see what should these young guys kind of, I think, so take some of those tertiary reps.
You mentioned a name that I'm fascinated with, and that's Kyle Casper. Not necessarily a guy that was on my radar. Then you see him in the spring game and say, that's just kind of a different body type than what you see in this Oregon Ducks wide receiver room. And again, you have your guys. What are some of the other wide receivers that can kind of provide value as pass catchers? Kyle Casper as just being that vertical threat, a matchup nightmare, a big, long kid that can run vertically down the field. He's a guy that I think can kind of crack into that rotation. And then obviously,
it seemed like they wanted to use him in that spring game. He was doing a fair amount of burn. He was making plays and being dynamic. And again, you kind of talk. You have your top 2, but I do think there is kind of room to add a guy like Kyle Casper, because I don't think you look at Gary Bryan, Trayshawn Holden, I don't think they have exactly what he has. And I think you look at Tez and Evan Stewart even, guys don't have what Kyle Casper.
Yeah, Kyle Casper's a unicorn in that wide receiver room. The last guy I'll kind of mention, Jurion Dickey. You wish you got to see more of him as a true freshman. It was just really hard to get involved in that wide receiver room. I give him all the credit in the world for staying. You see a lot of 5-star wide receivers that would probably look for different spots with how loaded this wide receiver room is. Can he take that step going into year 2? That's another storyline. Going to kind of another fascinating position group, at least for me, and that's the edge rusher position. We spent a lot of the offseason talking about the young edge rushers, guys like Mateo Tate and Blake Purchase. They're all going to play, right? I think the bigger question we have is, which one of those names is going to kind of emerge as the guy that's not really leaving the field? And I think largely, what one of these players are looking to take that year 2 step heading into the 2024 year?
I almost look at it like, can they do a little bit better job, I think, getting these guys in positions to be really, really good, where, again, can you use them in specific situations? And sort of again, how you've seen Georgia, they've had pass rushers under Dan Lanning where they're not great against the run or have sort of limits in their skill sets, but they do something really, really well. I'm kind of wondering if Oregon can do a bit of a better job featuring guys to make more plays, because I think that's one thing we all think, or at least certainly us, we think that there weren't enough plays made from that defensive line. So can they do a bit of do more with rotating and getting guys on the field in the moments where they want to play, getting Mateo Yu lined up inside and letting him rush on the interior, like things like that, where you can more maximize the skill set of room that, again, I think you have a guys who can do a lot of different things when I'm looking at this Oregon D-line.
I would agree with that. And I think you make a really good point in terms of, all right, Mateo, you might be one of your better run defenders on first and second down on the edge. Then you look at third and long situations. Do you play around with maybe kicking Mateo Yu on the inside, letting Blake Purchase or Tatum Tuioti have some more opportunity to get after the passer? Georgia has done that, specifically under Dan Lanning, in terms of how they rotate the guys on the defensive line. Last position group I think I'm just intrigued in terms of how it stacks out, the running back room. Like, who is going to be the guy in this running back room? My personal favorite, Jordan James. I think this kid's one of the most underrated players in the country heading into 2024. But then you have Noah Whittingham coming back from injury. Then you have the Division II transfer in Jay Harris, who I know a lot of Oregon Duck fans are very high on. They're all going to get touches. I think the question is, who's going to be that true running back one in this Oregon offense? If they even have a running back one, they certainly just might rotate all three of those guys. That's probably the last position group I'm looking at. They're number two, and probably the most fascinating conversation. My favorite part about fall camp is all just kind of hearing the stories of those young guys that maybe you didn't really know heading into fall camp, but you kind of find out they're going to be difference makers in 2024. I'll give you the T-box here. If you were to kind of predict one guy that we start hearing some serious buzz out of, a guy that might be a true freshman or going into year two, what name you going with?
Okay, so I'm not going to take it to the young guy, but I think this guy is more crucial in terms of him needing to break out, not break out in just like playing good football, but break out and playing dominant football. And I think it's Justin Jacobs. I think there were, again, big moments in Washington or Oregon season last year where, like, Washington, they know they're going to run the ball in that Big Ten championship or Pac-12 championship game, I should say, and they're not getting stops. I think they need more out of this linebacker room. I think you look at how talented Justin Jacobs is with that length, that size, that speed, that sort of athletic tools that he has. I think you want to see him playing the way Georgia's linebackers played under Dan Lanning, the Quay Walkers, the Channing Tindalls, the little dude who I'm blanking on his name.
Kobe Dean. I can't believe you forgot about my guy, Kobe Dean.
So you had them playing with their hair on fire, playing incredibly fast. I don't think Justin Jacobs was quite playing that way. And you saw flashes of it for sure. But I think he's a guy who has so much more to give this Oregon Ducks team. And I think he's a guy, again, a more healthy season, another offseason with Dan Lanning. I think look out for him to kind of be one of like an all-conference type.
Yeah, we know Dan Lanning can coach up linebackers. Like that's one thing we're pretty dang confident in heading into 2024. And I kind of like that shout out because, again, this is a kid that can be an all-conference caliber guy. It's not like he played bad football in 2023. It's more like, hey, we know you can be an NFL caliber dude, an all Big Ten caliber dude. Can you put it together in 2024?
And I think you don't need it, but it certainly goes a long way. And I think taking, again, where Oregon's margins just aren't that big, taking them up another notch, being able to win some of those big games that obviously they haven't been able to do quite yet under Dan Lanning.
My pick's going to be Aaron Flowers, true freshman. You look at the safety position and say, all right, Tasheem Johnson, Kobe Savage, you feel pretty solid about those two. They've played a lot of football. Outside of that, you're kind of thin at safety. That's really the only position group that I look at and say, I might have question marks about the 2 and 3 deep. You're going to rely on some true freshmen. Aaron Flowers was one of my favorite kids coming out of high school from the state of Texas, then backed it up in the spring game. Aaron Flowers is physically ready to go. He looked in the spring game like between the ears. He certainly was ready to go too. You saw the instinct, saw him flying around, making plays on the football. That's one of the names.
Back end, like that true kind of free safety look where he was making plays on the ball, showing some of that range. And again, that's a position like you kind of like what Tasheem Johnson, Kobe Savage can be in the box. I think both of them play pretty good when they're around the line of scrimmage. I think, again, you still need to find that free safety, that really, really good instinctive free safety. And I think, again, you saw flashes of that from Aaron Flowers. And I think that position is kind of ripe for the taking. I'm not sure it's like a position that needs to be incredible, just given how good the cornerback position is. but I think you need someone to replace what Evan Williams was giving them last year because he was such a weapon for that defense.
I think the last name I want to shout out is Kenny Sadiq. And again, like you're talking about these young cats that might not necessarily be starters for Oregon because the roster is so loaded. Are there ways that they are getting Kenny Sadiq involved to kind of hit some of those explosive plays? Because again, you have your guy in Terrence Ferguson. Oregon sometimes goes to the two personnel sets, but I don't see them running too many two tight end personnel sets as I stumble over my words because the wide receivers are so good. You don't want to take the wide receivers off the field. Can you get Kenny Sadiq a little bit more involved? He is one of the freakiest athletes on this Oregon team. I fully trust Will Stein to get his playmakers the football. Kenny Sadiq's the last guy I'm keeping an eye on.
You can put out there as like a jumbo slot. And again, I'm kind of with you. I don't necessarily see Oregon using a ton of like crowd the line of scrimmage, play the way Michigan kind of plays where you just want to create a zillion gaps in your run scheme and go try to hammer teams. Oregon's offense is very much predicated on space, and that is what when you have Evan Stewart and obviously Tez Johnson, you need to get those guys the ball in those areas, be able to spread teams out and make them cover a lot of ground. So I don't think you're going to see a bunched up, but again, when you have an athlete like Kenny Sadiq, he can play pretty much anywhere on the field.
Yeah, and it's not like we need Kenny Sadiq to play every single snap on the offensive side of the football, just finding creative ways where you can get the football into his hands and let him go be an athlete. Because again, I have a hard time seeing them taking these wide receivers off the field consistently in 2024. Going to the last question mark we have, and that's just depth. Again, you look at this Oregon team, we're going to be doing a lot of these fall camp previews. We have serious question marks about a lot of these different Power 4 teams. You look at Oregon, you don't have that many question marks. I think a lot of the question marks are you deep enough at these positions to go win a national title? And that's a massive storyline that's not necessarily the flashiest thing to talk about, but you look at Georgia or you look at Michigan, what made those teams so good and so good late in the season is they had depth. They had the ability to keep guys fresh when you did have injuries. You had guys that could step up and still be contributors, not really miss a beat. Looking at the positions that I'm kind of looking at in terms of question marks at depth, I want to go to the offensive line. I have been very vocal in saying that I think this offensive line is going to be one of the better units, not only in the Big Ten, but in the country. You have legitimately two NFL caliber guys at tackle. You have two really experienced guys at guard, and you have bringing Poncho at center. My question marks are not necessarily do they have the – I guess how I should frame it is I'm not saying they don't have depth on the offensive line. We just don't know it yet because we didn't really see a ton of these guys play a ton of football in 2023. So
but I also think, again, you even go to the spring game, there were some moments when that kind of second grouping and you saw guys like George Silva struggle a little bit at times on the edge, blocking those edge rushers for Oregon, who are obviously very good. But again, when you talk about teams like Michigan, like, can you go down with your best offensive lineman, Zach Zinner, breaks his leg in that Ohio State game, and you kind of can roll it and then go play really physical and tough against a really good Alabama team? So, again, like, I do think it's fair to, like, wonder because there were some moments in that spring game where you're like, well, this first team, no doubt about them, they're stars, they're studs. But again, as you've also not seen these guys in a ton of games and also seen some moments in the spring game that weren't super ideal, I think it's fair to question it. And it's not saying that it's not going to get fixed, but it is something as you watch their fall camp kind of roll out, I think you question it. And then another reason I think is you haven't had enough time in Dan Lanning's program to build up through the trenches and build your recruiting classes up through that world. So again, I don't think it's totally unfair. Their top line, really, really good offensive line, but I think there's fair to wonder if they suffer one or two injuries, like can they weather a storm?
Yeah, that's because, again, you look at the offensive line and there are going to be games where maybe one of your guys is dinged up. You have to do some reshuffling. It's a question, and I think it'll be a more important question when we get into the college football playoffs. They're playing for a Big Ten championship, which, again, I fully expect the Oregon Ducks to kind of be in contention for. The other position, and we kind of talked about safety, so we'll kind of skip over that with guys like Aaron Flowers coming in. Peyton Woodard's another guy that I probably should have shouted out when we were talking about the safeties. The defensive line. Now, you have to give Dan Lanning a ton of credit. This was probably our biggest question mark about Oregon heading into spring after the 2023 season. You're bringing Jamari Caldwell. You're bringing Derek Carmen. Makes us feel a heck of a lot better about the depth on the inside of the defensive line. I think my question is kind of coupling and piggybacking off the breakout performers is a guy like Jericho Johnson. or Aiden Breland ready to step into the rotation as well for Oregon on the inside of the defensive line? You're going to find that out. That's when you find out about these young guys along the line of scrimmage. You get pads and shoulder, you get a helmet and shoulder pads on them, and kind of just see if they can hang with grown men along the line of scrimmage. We're going to find out that in fall camp, and I think I'm very excited to find out if they are going to be ready as true freshmen.
Because now you do have your two top line guys. You have your two top end performers, especially with Derek Harmon, who is a really, really good player. But I think, again, you kind of look like Amari Washington's a guy we're really high on. Thought he had good moments in his freshman year, especially in that bowl game where you saw the violence, the physicality that I think you were missing at times from certain Oregon defensive linemen. So, again, I think you're starting to build that. But I do think, you're probably going to have to rely on some young guys, some true freshmen, some redshirt freshmen. I think that's kind of where Oregon's going to frankly be. So, again, when you talk about those high-level questions for Oregon and what's going to separate them from an Ohio State or a Georgia, those are the type of things you need someone probably to kind of outplay what you're kind of expecting from them.
Got to give a shout-out to Tyon Gray as well. He, again, not as much talked about because he wasn't like the blue chippers that Jericho Johnson and Aiden Breland were. Thought Tyon Gray, you talk about the guy who looked most ready. It might have been him on the defensive line as a true freshman. So that's another guy I'll throw into that mix as well. Bill, we'll cut it there. We got a lot to talk about as fall camp kicks off for the Oregon Ducks. Again, to the Oregon fans, we appreciate you guys more than you know for rocking with the fellas. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Much more importantly, let it fly in the comment section some of your biggest storylines because, again, that's what we're going to be covering for you guys during fall camp. We'll talk to y'all later. Peace.